The Data Nerd, Episode 2, Data Storytelling Beyond the Numbers.
Storytelling has been around for a long time, even before data.
In fact, I think the term data storytelling kind of gets in the way because more focus is on the data, I think, than on the storytelling. And I think there's different types of data storytelling.
Welcome to the Data Nerd Podcast. I'm your host, Nisar Ahmed. Join me as we explore the inner data nerd inside all of us. Dive into the world of data alongside special guests who not only share their wealth of experience and knowledge, but also unveil what truly makes them data nerds. This podcast is brought to you by Business Intelligence. That's BIZNIS Intelligence. You can subscribe to my YouTube channel at Business Intelligence to stay up to date with Tableau training and the Data Nerd podcast. Connect with me on LinkedIn or stream the Data Nerd podcast across all major podcast platforms.
Welcome, everyone, to the Data Nerd podcast. Today, I have the pleasure to welcome Lee Feinberg as our guest. Lee founded DecisionViz in 2012 to help data leaders create armies of trustworthy decision makers. Lee developed the Design to Act system as a way for organizations to scale data storytelling and data literacy. He has worked for 20 years in analytics, data visualization, and strategy. Lee is also an accomplished educator as an instructional assistant for the University of Chicago's Masters in Applied Data Science program and adjunct facility at NYU. For over a decade, Lee has worked with Tableau Software as a services partner, leading the New Jersey and New York user groups, and serving as a four-time ambassador and Tableau Foundation contributor. Lee is also an avid concert goer. Deadpool is his favorite movie. He enjoys weightlifting and biking. He's also married to Lori, and they have two children, Matt and Aaliyah. So welcome, Lee. Pleasure to have you on.
Good to be here. Good to see you as always.
So before we jump in, I just got a follow-up question on one of your on your introduction there. You talked about Deadpool. So it's kind of timely because to be I do love superhero movies, but I only just started watching Deadpool last week. I watched the first two.
Oh,
It took me, I think they came out 8 years ago, the first one. I don't know why I held off for so long, but now that I saw it, I thought it's amazing. What I know the Wolverine Deadpool movie's coming out this year. I'm like, I got to get caught up. I'm like, I don't know why I haven't watched it already.
the
So
first one was fantastic. The second one was like okay, but the first one was I
yeah,
can watch it over and over again. I think it's so funny.
awesome. So before we get started, I usually like to ask our guests an introductory question about what makes you a data nerd. So, data is all around us and there's a wealth of data, right? And I myself realized I was a data nerd very early on in my childhood when I used to start recording data on video games that I played with my brother and start analyzing that. So that is when I realized I was a data nerd. So my question for you, Lee, is are you a data nerd? And if so, tell me your story and when you realized you were one.
Wow. Well, I'm going to answer in a slightly different way.
Okay.
Uh, so I got involved with data by accident. So I don't know that I was a data nerd at heart,
Mhm.
but I think my nerdiness came out when my kids were little and we made charts of all of their Halloween candy. And I went out on the internet and got images of every single candy that they had so that I could use that in the making of the chart. I think that's pretty nerdy.
Uh, that definitely is. So, were you working in analytics at that time, though?
I was
Okay.
already involved, and I did it with Tableau. But they loved it. They thought it was the coolest thing and brought it into class. And
Yeah, I think it's cool how, I think we underestimate how useful data visualization is, even for kids at a young age, right? To teach them at that age is, I think, important now. And we're going to talk about, our topic today is data storytelling, right? So this is on topic, and I think, and you can probably tell us better than I can. Data storytelling, even at a young age, is a useful skill to learn.
Yeah, I think kids today are surrounded by it. They just may not think of it that way.
Yeah.
Right. Because so much on their phone, and if they're old enough and they're tracking any kind of activity, any kind of athletic information, it's all data. They probably don't think of it that way, as much. They're just like, oh, it's just tracking how far I ran or how much weight I lifted or how many likes I got on my Instagram, right? I mean, that's data.
It's all
They
data.
just
Yeah.
don't think of it necessarily that way, but it all is.
Yeah, that's
Certainly
true.
the companies that are collecting it think of it that way.
Oh, of course. It's a valuable resource for all the companies, right? Yeah, I know when I was growing up, I had nothing like that, right? I wish I did, but there was nothing at that time. So, times have changed and technology has changed, and but I think, on the topic of storytelling, right? Storytelling has been around for a long time, even before data. All right. And you leverage storytelling with data. So can you talk a little bit about, what data storytelling is and why it's important in the field of data analytics?
Yeah, I agree with you, right? In fact, I think the term data storytelling kind of gets in the way because more focus is on the data, I think, than on the storytelling. If you think about the emphasis on the words. And I think there's different types of data storytelling as well, which also adds to the confusion in the field. I think there is a lot of confusion, and I'll kind of go through them. I think one is using features that are called stories or that have that kind of terminology in it. I don't think that's telling a story. It's just using a feature. If you're good at telling stories, then you can be good at using a feature like that.
Mm.
Then there's the story where you're presenting some known facts. You uh, are taking people through the discussion. You may or may not use that typical kind of, oh, we have a rising in the story and then a crest and then a falling
Mm.
off of the story. You may not have to do that. And then there's the stories about just what's going on day to day in the business, right? You can frame that as a story. I think it's very powerful because if you do any of those, it takes you out of the data itself and focuses on the facts that are important. Why are you telling the story? What's the point of the story? What do you want someone to do because of the story versus the data? And I think that's the difference here.
So you're saying it's more about the key actions and the takeaways rather than how you present the story itself?
Yeah. Well, of course, how you present it is important because that's going to determine if you can get your point across. But I think this is even in the days of just having basic PowerPoint, 30 years ago, or Harvard graphics, many of
Yeah.
those, right? You could still do data storytelling. It's just now the applications are so much more powerful than they were back then. I think it's kind of taken on a life of its own, but it's been there for a long time.
Yeah.
And like you said, storytelling's been around for hundreds of thousands of years with a
Yeah.
powerful.
That's interesting because, um, so you talked about, so the tools are there, the technology is there. I tell people, so I teach a class in data analytics, and I tell them being a data analyst is not just about the tech. Okay, it's also about the soft skills and communication, right? Because ultimately, what we are like the middleman between the business and the data or the tech or IT, whatever it may be,
Yeah.
right? And we need to translate that and have them understand, or have the stakeholders or the business understand it, right? And what can separate you apart from other people is not how you use the tool, or the technical knowledge you have, but how you communicate it to your audience, right? So how important is the soft skills, and what do you need to be good at in data storytelling? Do you have to be a good communicator, verbally, written, or what does it take to be a good data storyteller from a soft skills perspective?
The first thing is I'll offer a change in thinking.
Okay.
That what we call the soft skills are really the hard skills. And I mean, like, being a good communicator is actually much harder than learning how to use the software, and maybe even learning to be a good analyst to an extent. I mean, being an analyst is a real skill that you have to practice, right? It's not just throwing some numbers into a table and saying, "Oh, I'm an analyst." It's got its own methodologies and practices. But I think that one of the things is to be curious about the business. If you just think about it from a storytelling from a business perspective, is to really want to investigate why something's happening. Because if you don't do that thorough research, like a detective or a journalist, I think your story won't have the depth that you want it to. You won't uncover maybe the real aha moment. You'll just kind of scratch the surface.
Mm.
But ultimately, I think it's to develop the skills takes time and practice. And frankly, I think most people don't want to put the effort in on their own, or their companies don't realize it's a skill that needs to be built. They just say, "Oh, just tell a data story." Like somehow magically you're born with that ability, when it's one of the hardest things to do. Because you have to be able to organize your thoughts. You have to maybe get up in front of a room and speak in front of people, which is also not an easy skill. There's a lot there, and people just make it sound like it's as easy as firing up the software and making the story. And I think that's a big roadblock.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think the what you said about getting up and presenting, I think that's probably the biggest roadblock to a lot of people, right? I feel like sometimes people may have imposter syndrome, and they think that they're not qualified to talk to people, and sometimes those thoughts run in your head, right? But I also think sometimes we're a harsher critic of ourselves than others are of us. And if we let that stop us from doing things, then I don't think that prevents us from growing as well. Um, so let's talk about some of the tools, right? So we talked about the the tools have advanced, right? And you have experience with Tableau. Tell me about your experience in the Tableau world.
Now,
And
I've
have
been
you used
involved
other
with,
tools as well? Have you used other tools, like Power BI, for
well,
example?
I've used Excel, I've used PowerPoint, I've used Keynote, um, but I haven't really used, I would say, any other tools that would be comparable to Tableau on any kind of consistent base. I don't know them nearly as well as Tableau. I got involved with Tableau in 2009. The company was already 5 or 6 years old at that point, and I had one license. I convinced the company I was working for. I was working for Nokia. I convinced them to let me buy one license because I figured I needed something better than Excel to do my work.
Mm.
And then it just kind of grew from there. And it really became an unexpected experience, in that the CMO, at least at the time, Lisa Fink, asked me to start up the New York user group. And I think in February of 2010, we had the first one and it was a snowy day, and some people drove to White Plains, New York, to our U.S. headquarters, and we had the first meeting. And I ran the user groups, and started one in New Jersey also. So I ran them kind of alternating months for 8.5 years. So invested a lot of time, met a lot of people, had a lot of good experiences with that. And then when Nokia was kind of fizzling out, as a company, I left and decided to become a Tableau partner. So I was an early partner since in 2012 I joined up. So for just over a decade now, I've been a Tableau partner. So I was in the beginning. I just had a vision that Tableau would become substantial. At the time, still nobody had really heard about it back then. But now, of course, it's I don't want to say it's a household name, but certainly in analytics and
Yeah.
business, most people know what Tableau is. And I also joined up with the Tableau Foundation. So I was doing my workshops in storytelling with nonprofits that were working with Tableau. So I was able to really kind of spread the word about storytelling to organizations like Feeding America, World Food Program, which was nice because they flew me to Rome for a week to work with them. And I was a Tableau ambassador 4 times. So I really had a lot of different experiences with Tableau that were all great in their own ways, but all very different.
Yeah. And I love Tableau as well, and I'm a Tableau guy as well. But I think, regardless, storytelling is not just for Tableau, right? You can use any tool. Like you said, you mentioned Excel, Power BI, or any other business intelligence tool, right? That skill of data storytelling is not really dependent on any specific tool per se. Would you agree?
Absolutely. In fact, I really emphasize that when I'm working with clients because what I teach them is an approach in the same way that if you know how to write, let's just say in English, writing language, whether I pick up a pen or a pencil or I use a word processor, I'm writing with the same skills. And it's the same in visualization. Probably even more importantly, because your company might switch the tools or probably
Mhm.
use multiple tools. Because even if you use something like Tableau or Power BI or Click, you probably still have to use PowerPoint or Keynote or some kind of presentation tool.
Yeah.
And it's not like you're going to switch your skills. You're going to do it one way in Tableau and say, oh, well, now I use PowerPoint. I'm going to approach the problem of storytelling in a completely different approach. You're not going to do that. So I just think of these as, and I don't mean to simplify them in any way, but Tableau in some ways is like a visual word processor. If you know what you want it to say, if you know the story you want to write, you can write with it,
Yeah.
and you can take those same skills and do it to Power BI or any of the other applications.
Yeah. But there are certain best practices when it comes to data visualization, right? And how to tell the story. So
Absolutely.
when you talk about the visual aspect of it, like what role does visualization play in data storytelling, and how can it enhance the narrative?
I think there's a couple ways to think about that, and I'll start with a slightly different place than the visual. So we have this phrase that I use with customers, what's called intent before content, and it goes back to this idea of communication. That the point of the story or even just a chart on its own is to communicate some idea, get someone to do something, get a point across, get them to take an action. And until you know that point you want to make, you can't figure out the best way to visually represent that. And then you can go and get the data. What most people do is the reverse of that. They have the data, they make the chart, and then they put some kind of vague title on the chart or on the dashboard or on the story. So we kind of reverse the process of you have to know that message first.
But
And
how
then
do you
you
get
can
the
get down to the
message?
visual.
How do you get the message without first creating the visual? Like, okay, I have the data, right? I want to know what the message is here. I would create a bar chart or a line chart or whatever visual it is, and then and then I see the trends, and then I get the
Mm-hmm.
message. Isn't that the process? Are you saying that you need
Mm.
or am I looking at it the wrong way?
No, I think there's a separation though. What you're talking about is an analysis phase and a story writing phase. So I may do an analysis where I make all kinds of charts, right, to go through the data, look for ideas about what is going on, look for the connections between the different data sets, right?
Mhm.
I may not take, and I may say, oh, I see a point that I'd like to take out of that. Doesn't mean I'm going to use those particular charts that I used in my analysis. In fact, I may use, depending on my sophistication, I might use very complex charts to do that I would never show someone. So I think there's a difference between an analysis and what charts you use there, finding the message, and then saying, okay, now I have, and it depends on my audience too, right? My audience might be very sophisticated or it might be very unsophisticated.
Yeah.
I have to just, right? So that's why knowing what I want to say, and then I decide how I want to get that message across. And so, but I think you make that distinction between the analysis phase and the actual delivery of what someone sees in the end.
So you bring up a good point, right? You have to take into account your audience, right? And you need to customize your message, your delivery based on who you're delivering it to, right? And so what I'm understanding from what you're saying is there's a difference between doing analysis and storytelling. They're two different things. Is that right?
I think they can. I think they're different, but obviously they're connected, right? Because
Yeah.
the analysis was what you're going through and you're finding, and the story is ultimately what you may deliver to somebody. Because someone really doesn't care about as much about the analysis that you did.
Yeah.
You inject elements of it to give credibility. You don't just want to gloss over it, but you may do a lot more in the analysis that doesn't ever see the light of day. We go through this a lot with the work that I do with students at the University of Chicago, and they have to present their capstone projects. And we work with them mostly because companies that want to hire the students have given the university the guidance that the students actually need to be better at communication,
Mhm.
which is why they brought me in, is they have to get away from the guts of the algorithms and the analysis and the bits and the bytes of the data and say, what's important about what we found? Why does it matter?
Yeah.
Not how did we do, that we used a random forest and we compared it to an X boost and these are the coefficients and all that stuff is really irrelevant. You have to prove that you know what you're doing, but you don't want to show that as much as the why that's important or why that influenced your decision. That's much more valuable.
Yeah, that I agree, because sometimes like when you do the work and you put in a lot of time and effort into it and you're proud of what you do and you want to be able to showcase that. But at the end of the day, if I'm an executive or like I'm a VP or president, I don't really it doesn't matter how you got the analysis done. I just want to know what the key takeaways are for me. What do I need
Yeah.
to action from that? Right. We hired you for a reason. We know you know what you're doing. You don't need to prove it to me. Right. And I think that's sometimes and I notice that in presentations too, especially new students or people getting to analytics, they focus a lot on the minute details that are not relevant to the audience.
Yeah, it's a shame. It's hard because like you said, you put a lot of effort in and there's pride in your work and you care about it. The problem is the other people don't care as
Yeah.
much about it.
That's the truth. Yeah.
And they're the ones that matter, right? Whether you want
Yeah.
to call them customers, stakeholders, uh, it's really about them as the audience.
Yeah. So let's talk about some of the challenges in data storytelling. What are some of the common challenges that you may face in data storytelling, and how do you overcome them? And I guess another question off of that is, what advice would you give to someone who wants to improve some of their data storytelling skills?
Yeah, you started to get at it before when you talked about best practices. And I think that's kind of the table stakes or the grounding that you need. If you think about storytelling as writing rather than just storytelling, one of the first things we do is just teach people how to write better. So just learning the structures of visualization, helping them understand that it is a language with rules and how those rules relate. You could take something that you have today, And instead of completely revamping it, let's say in the form of a story, if you just rewrote it to follow some of these rules, think about it as someone taking a red pen to it, right? And editing it, you could make it a lot better. So that's the first thing, is just to know what some of those best practices are, understanding how human beings interpret information, how they process it. You don't have to understand the guts of it, but you just have to know the rules so that you can stick more to the rules rather than doing what the software says. Or because the software, even Tableau, lets you do bad things.
Mm-hmm.
It lets you do things that are wrong in terms of how someone expects. When I say someone, I mean how your brain generally expects the information to show up, because there's some rules about that. And Tableau lets you violate those. And so you think, oh, well, if Tableau lets me do that, it must be okay.
Yeah.
Right? That's what I would think as a general user. You would think, well, it wouldn't let me do something that was bad, but it does at times.
You see that a lot
So you
with
have to
new
be
students, right? You see that a lot with new students who are using Tableau the first time. They're like, wow, I could do so much with this. And then they put all the visuals into one dashboard and like the rainbow of colors. And it defeats the purpose of using it, right? There's no clarity. There's no
exactly.
it's very confusing.
Yeah, that's an easy one to pick on, right? Because people love color, but I say color is great, but it's so abused because, again, people don't necessarily know the impact of what that does. And it gives you better control of writing and of the software when you understand these things. So that's kind of just the first part. The second part is how do you structure a story? So just as if you were to sit down and write a story like they taught you in, I don't know, let's say third grade,
Mm.
right? When you wrote the most basic story, what do you want the story to be about? Write an outline, write the main ideas. Similar thing. Uh, People want to jump into the software right away. And you should actually stay out of the software as long as possible and organize your thoughts just like you would any other story. Again, it goes back to this idea of what's your message? What do you want to communicate? See how that flows together. And once you have that, you start piecing it together. You can group things into chapters of your story, right? You put main ideas together so that you don't have just a bunch of data on a page and those ideas aren't related. Doesn't make sense. So again, it's following a lot of principles about writing a story that you would be familiar with and adapting them to just how you do that in the world of using data instead of really just words.
Yeah.
But it takes practice, right? You just, again, a company shouldn't just say, oh, just write a data story. You have to teach people how to do it. You have to show them. You have to give them the skills.
Yeah.
Especially because the biggest, and I'll say this is the biggest problem that we face today. We face it even just with, forget about storytelling, just with giving people software. You don't give people a consistent way and expectation on how to use it, then everybody just does it however they think is right or looks best, and you get this mix, right? So you could walk into a meeting and you might show the same exact data one way, and I might show it a completely different way, even but we have no consistency in that, and that's a big problem. Again, it's just like letting people loose and giving no guidelines, no guardrails to how people should approach presenting the data is another big issue.
Yeah, and so my previous podcast, my previous guest, Justin Shimmick, he does the Data Career Summit, and he does an analysis of the top skill sets that people put in job descriptions for data analytics, and now you see data storytelling in there, right? It's an actual skill set along with Tableau, SQL, Excel, whatever other skills there are. Data storytelling you're seeing that out there now. So the importance of knowing how to tell a story, you're seeing that come up. And I think all the points that you talked about are great, and I think it's something that's I think people don't pay enough attention to when they get into data analytics. So tell me a little bit about, DecisionViz and what you guys do and how people can connect with you and get in touch with you.
Yeah, so the main thing that we do is one, run workshops that teach people to have like a 1 day version of it, and then we have a very immersive version that takes months to go through when you really want to skill up your team and really have them go through a project so that they can get the full experience. And part of that you mentioned earlier, this design to act methodology actually gets a lot into the backside, which is what we call go to market, which is what most people forget about. This usually you just build a dashboard or story, you publish it, and you move on to the next one. What we actually need to do is figure out, did it actually at some point help someone achieve what it was supposed to do? And so the idea of design to act is to think about your work as a product versus a project. And I won't get into the details of that, but that's a big shift in the mindset of how you go about doing the work. We also help clients who are struggling and they may have a set of dashboards and they just know that they could be doing better. And we come in and use the design to act methodology with them in reimagining what their work should be to really put it in more the form of a story rather than a dashboard or a report. And we'll help them through that. Those are the two main things that we help clients with. Then we do some work in Tableau, but we prefer to actually have our clients do any work in Tableau if possible. It's just better. It's better for their learning rather than if we were to do it. And people want to get in touch with me, they can just go to the website, which is DecisionViz, VIZ.com. And they can also connect with me on LinkedIn. I love to chat with people on there, and it's a great forum for having conversations in this area.
That's great. No, thank you so much for this. This is a great topic, great discussion. I'm sure we could have talked for another 30 minutes on this, right?
Oh yeah.
But I love the topic and appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and look forward to more episodes.
Awesome, great. Thank you, Lee.